when you find yourself in uncomfortable family conversations where nobody knows what to say anymore because so much has happened on the American social landscape. TV really does bring us all together. And TV from the 80s or the 90s sometimes is that common ground. And you stand there long enough and you talk about that show and people start to become themselves again. So I will always hold that candle out and leave that light on for everybody to have a happier tomorrow. Welcome to Advanced TV Herstory. I'm your host, Cynthia Bemis Abrams. This is the place where we connect the dots of TV and feminism to American culture and politics. If you like what you hear, head to tvherstory.com and listen into all of our archives that are categorized to make it easier to find what you're looking for. And also while you're there, please sign up for our newsletter. Promise I'll never sell your information. Now on with the show. Welcome, TV Herstorians, to Advanced TV Herstory. Today, I am joined by two wonderful women who, it feels like I've known them a long time, but in fact, it's only been about 2 years and a few months. They are podcasters in the sphere of TV and women. What more could we have in common? There is more, and you're going to learn more about Susan Lambert and Sharon Johnson, who are, I'll call them 2/3 of the 80s TV ladies, because I've also met Melissa Roth, who is the behind the scenes guru, I don't know, wizard. She's an incredible person. And so the 80s TV Ladies podcast started just a little more than 2 years ago. So the summer of 2022. And we were all so much younger then. And
yes.
But here we are in 2024, and Susan and Sharon are going to stick around for a nice long conversation, because when the three of us get talking about TV, you just never know what direction it's going to go. Welcome, Sharon and Susan.
Thank you so much for having us.
We're really excited to be here. We're big fans of your podcast.
Well, and I am of yours, and grateful that you have explored some series that were fundamental to people watching TV, to women watching TV, and some of the showrunners and the writers and the performers who you've brought on has been important to sort of filling out that big picture of such an important decade. So congratulations on this accomplishment. So tell the Advanced TV Herstorians, who are probably right now subscribing to 80s TV Ladies in their podcast players, how did you guys come to form this? It is a fun story. And how does it connect with your individual professional backgrounds?
Well, it makes sense for Susan to start this off, since honestly, this adventure was her idea. So Susan?
Well, I've known Sharon since the 80s. We met through a mutual friend and stayed friends since then. We both ended up working at Disney, her at ABC, me at Disney Studios, kind of about the same time. And we thought, oh, we'll have lunch every day. It'll be so much fun. And then we never saw each other. But during the early days of COVID, like many people, I was binging television, mostly 70s and 80s television. And it brought up questions of, for me, about representation of women. I loved those shows, but I had a lot of questions. And I was like, there should be a podcast about 80s television and the representation of women. I didn't know about your podcast yet. I thought there wasn't one. I was like, well, and my husband often challenges me when I go, this should exist. He goes, well, why don't you write it or make it or do it? And then I do. So I was like, I'm going to make a podcast about looking back at female-driven television shows from the 1980s and answer my questions. And I'm a behind-the-scenes gal. I usually, at first I was like, I'll get somebody to host it. And then I was like, no, I want to talk about this stuff. And I was like, who can I talk about pop culture with that will have a different but similar perspective to me? And neither of us have any performing experience, really. Mm-hmm. So I called up Sharon. Sharon was literally, I was like, Sharon, would you do this crazy adventure with me? I'm going to do this show. And she was like, sure.
It sounded like such a great idea for me to get a chance to talk about something that I spend probably way too much time watching. I love television, have always loved television. But I will say that for me, and our initial thought about the podcast actually was we decided we weren't going to do like an episode by episode recap of the stories of the shows that we were talking about. Initially, we were thinking maybe season by season, sort of see how the show evolves and talk about that. Maybe have some guests on, but that was more pie in the sky. We figured it would just be the two of us really just talking about it. And the first show we started with was Susan's pick, which was something that was very formative for her, Scarecrow and Mrs. King.
Mm-hmm.
And we reached out to a couple women that worked on the show, and by God, they said yes, and they would be guests. So we thought, well, that's pretty cool. Maybe we should try that with some of the other shows. And so that's how it's sort of evolved. It's become less a Susan and I talking about individual seasons, more general, but we've had the opportunity through the show to meet and talk with and listen to and hear the stories of women who worked in television in the 1980s, some of whom are still working in television. And unlike Susan, I sat and watched. I really didn't think too much about how it all got made. So I think it's probably been, from that standpoint, more of a learning experience for me, a delightful learning experience, and for Susan, because I think, Susan, you always had more of an understanding because you wanted to work in television behind the scenes and production and so forth, hence film school. So that's kind of how it all got started.
Well, if I can just speak on behalf of Advanced TV Herstory listeners, and from my heart, I hope when you celebrate these women, when they're telling their stories and they're reliving that moment where perhaps they didn't even have the understanding of what it was that they were putting on the screen, to the significance of, it's only been like 8 years since we've even commonly understood what representation really is. Some less represented populations might, but for the ho-de-do white woman, it's taken us a long time for that light bulb to come on. Celebrate them for us and thank them, because what they have done is truly to help define and provide context to a decade that was so important in American and political culture.
That's one of the things that's been the gift of the podcast, and what I think unconsciously I was looking for. I think we all about 8 years ago went, how did we get here? And every day since then has almost been that question. And I think a lot of the work that I've been doing for the last 6 years has really been looking back in order to explain that question. I feel like the 70s and 80s, they were formative to me because that's when I was growing up and becoming a person. And television was such a huge part of that, more so than I even realized until we started this podcast.
Mm-hmm.
I went into film school to make films, to make movies, but television was so much a part of what I was growing up on that it was very much the language that we had to communicate and to learn.
If I can just pause for a moment on a statistic that I was reminded of just like yesterday, the Annenberg School commissions their study on representation. Particularly, I know the Gina Davis folks separated off and use Annenberg statistics for TV, but in film, still in 2023, only 30% of the speaking parts in films, movies, were from women who were either the lead actor, one of the leads, or a significant supporting character. 30% of the dialogue, 30% of the lines.
Well, and it's just interesting because it was something we, like the women that we talked to and that you talked to,
mm-hmm.
we weren't aware growing up what we were growing up into,
mm-hmm.
the culture we were growing up into, and how television and movies was reflecting who we were going to be allowed to be as people. Like, it was this real revelation to me long after film school that the films that I loved that had cis white male leads in them were not made for me.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't the main character in them.
Mm-hmm.
We, all disenfranchised folks learn to very much put themselves in that place and learn to kind of be like, oh, I'm going to root for the hero, whether I'll ever be that hero or not. I'm just going to, but that's what you're thinking when you're watching a movie. You're with the person you want to win.
Mm-hmm.
You want to be Indiana Jones. You want to be the best guy in the field. You want to be Rocky.
And
That's
when
who
we
you're
were
rooting for.
And when we were younger, at least for me, when we were younger, well, we had Jodie Foster in all of those Walt Disney movies. So we must be represented. And then there's this break. And so it's fine to be an orphaned girl in some adventure with Johnny Whitaker. But by golly, by the time you're 12, no, you're not really featured in this. You know, the 80s are an important decade because you have the buildup of the ERA and you have the execution of Title IX. And so those two movements together kind of populated the 70s. And I think that they are underappreciated for their roles as accelerants of the women's movement. And that combined with, and this is all second wave feminism for the most part, which a lot of people know and a lot of people have problems with, but still it's there. And it was a great opportunity for energy to all come together. Then you had the 80s. And with the 80s comes Ronald Reagan and a certain backlash, as discussed and written about by Susan Faludi. And TV shows then that sort of, it felt like some of them moved in the progressive direction, and some of them were like written by men who wanted to make TV look more like the 50s and 60s again. And so you guys picked a decade that's really important, because if you can't spell that out and put that kind of context to what we were watching, all of a sudden it all just feels like one big long jiggle show, you know?
We picked it because that was, our decade. But it is something, and I think one of the reasons the 80s does resonate with people. And one of the reasons is it was the clash between the 70s and what would become basically late 80s capitalism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a lot happening in culture. It was the beginning of sort of things starting to move quickly, right? CNN and, 24-hour news. And it started to feel overwhelming even in the 80s, that overwhelming feeling. There was the push-pull for LGBTQ rights, for civil rights. It was very much a pushback against the 60s and 70s, but it was complex, right? Mm-hmm. So you could have a strong female character, but it was unusual. They were almost always partnered with a man, right? So it's just an interesting time. Unless you but then you have shows like Designing Women and It's a Living that are all women kind of all the time. And those shows are so interesting and formative for people, along with the shows like Facts of Life, right?
Yes. Yeah.
That sort of were just so interesting because it was women, just women, really, and that's pretty unusual.
So Sharon, you mentioned that the one thing you guys, you three, including Melissa, did not want to do was a sort of episode by episode breakdown and discussing episodes and stuff. And you reached for this higher context. What other sorts of formats did you consider and dismiss?
I'm not sure there was anything else that we really discussed seriously, we started off with we're going to do a season at a time kind of thing. And then as we began to get guests coming on, and we didn't want to spend more than maybe, depending on how many seasons a show ran, we didn't really want to spend more than 4 or 5 episodes, perhaps maybe 6 on each show. Mm-hmm. So as we began to get people from the shows to come in and talk to us, that meant there were fewer episodes for us to cover the show. And then once again, Susan's brilliant idea to have the 90s TV babies join us and talk about the show. So every show we talk about, we have 3 folks born in the 90s who more than likely have never seen the show. Sometimes they've even heard of the show before we asked them to watch some episodes, because we wanted to get, a little perspective from their generation about what these shows were. Because initially we picked shows that we really loved. As I mentioned, Susan picked Scarecrow and Mrs. King. My first selection was Remington Steele, because despite the title of the show, to me, it was the Laura Holt show. Mm-hmm. And I loved her as one of the first female characters I remember seeing on television, who was unapologetically wanting to run her own life and do things her way. And she gets married, great. If she doesn't, that's fine too. If she has kids, maybe, who knows? But basically, this is what she wants to do. And this guy comes along and sort of steals her thunder. And then we ended that season with Cagney and Lacey, because how do you not cover Cagney and Lacey? So getting back to your original question, I think our formula, if you will, really hasn't changed significantly from what we started. We're still not doing an episode by episode thing. We're just broadening perhaps the women behind the scenes that we talk to and that we get to learn about, in addition to what we actually saw on the shows.
You're right, Sharon. The only thing that really has changed is we were going to do season by season. We thought, well, that means a show that was on for one season, we'll do one episode on. A show that's on, for 7 seasons, we get to do 7 episodes. And it didn't really work out that way because we started getting guests. So that's the only thing that changed. But we're still doing, I would say, 2 to 7 episodes per show, depending on the show.
Mm-hmm. We are fortunate. Here we are in 2024, and your team, having started your podcast kind of post-COVID or, mid-COVID, where Zoom and technology was all of a sudden much more understood by your guest. I can tell you, in 2016, somebody thought that just talking on their phone was going to be good enough to record. And, it was up to me to figure out how to record that. And it's like, it's not quite that easy. And by the way, please don't stand by the side of a highway. And that was a really good interview that just I literally had to transcribe it and just use her words. And that was a disappointment. So you have had guests, and some of these people, were in their 30s in the 1980s. And so you do the math and they're in their 70s. Tell me a little bit about how they work with technology, and have you encountered any glitches? I know you recorded an episode in a garage, right? Wasn't Tyne Daly? Didn't she come to your house?
This is where we record our episodes in person. So this is my garage office. It's my house, and it's been my office since we finished it. Like it wasn't a finished garage when we moved in. So yes, Tyne Daly did come here to our garage office in our house to record, because she was like, I don't really love technology. So I'd rather not Zoom. And that we have found that. So there are interviews we have done on the phone through Zoom phone, just send a phone number and go, because people didn't want to do Zoom. But we love doing in person. We also had Eilish Zabrowski, who was a really renowned costumer. She was the head of
Aaron Spelling.
Thank you. Head of Aaron Spelling's costume department for his entire studio. And she was delightful in person. We had a blast. Her husband was in here. My husband came in. It was a party.
Your garage is going to need a green room.
It does.
So, all right. So yes, Tyne Daly, Sharon Gless, Stephanie Zimbalist, as impressive people who we remember from TV. But you raised the point that you also have had some very talented women whose entire careers were spent making TV. So what are some of those names from both in front of the camera and behind?
I think we have to start with Eugenie Ross-Lemming, because she was the co-creator of Scarecrow and Mrs. King. She was our first guest, I believe. So no matter whether our guests have been Tyne Daly's, Sharon Gless's, Stephanie Zimbalist, people's names that you know, or people's names like Eugenie Ross-Lemming that maybe whose names you have not heard before. Each and every guest that we have had, we finish and we look at each other and go, well, that was amazing. Yeah, I think we have to start getting back to your original question. I think we have to start with Eugenie. She was fantastic, and told us all kinds of stories about her life and her career, and how she had just finished as one of the showrunners of Supernatural, was it?
Yes.
Right after when we talked to
that.
her. Yeah. So she's continued to work all these years. More recently, we had Nima Barnett as one of our guests, who was the first African-American woman to direct a network comedy back in the 1980s. And she directed What's Happening Now, and she has worked ever since, still working, and all sorts of women in between. feel like I have to pinch myself. I mean, just occasionally, because it's just been so amazing. And I could and have gone on and on and on about all of them. But yeah.
And I'm particularly interested in the writers directors. So here's the list: Eugenie Ross Leming, Martha Smith from Scarecrow Mrs. King, Robin Bernheim, writer producer, Stephanie Zimbalist. We have on new filmmakers and television makers. So Evan Ball, Jerem Schwartz, the stunt woman and living legend, Debbie Evans Levitt, Barney Rosenzweig, creator of Cagney and Lacey, Sharon Gless, Tyne Daly, director Karen Arthur. You have been on our podcast, Cynthia Bemis Abrams, Matt Baum, the Rainbow Remix ladies. For season 2, it's been Linda Bloodworth Thomason, Paul Kreppel from It's a Living, and Stan Zimmerman, who was a writer from Golden Girls and a ton of 80s stuff, but also still a writer now. The directors we've had on, Mary Lou Belli.
She just was nominated for the second year in a row this last time around for the Emmys for Best Director of a Comedy.
And actresses Elaine Heilvel and Nana Visitor, Nana Visitor, sorry. Nana Visitor. It's and then Glenn Gordon Caron, the creator of Moonlighting, which was insane. So it's been pretty incredible, the guests that we've been able to get on. And that doesn't include Isla Sabreski and, Cheryl Main and really behind the scenes people who have had incredible careers and have incredible stories. And so it's been pretty delightful. And you were the one that pointed out to us that we're archiving these stories. And, we started off going, we want to get a good story. And then we realized, because of the age of some of these people, because they have not been interviewed as much as they should have, they have not been given their flowers as much as they should have, that we're often, I feel that responsibility when we do these episodes, particularly with certain women or men we talk to.
You're actually capturing the history of all sorts of, not just in front of, but behind the camera as well, all of the people who are responsible for producing art. And now it's media studies, and it's gender studies, and in some cases it's justice studies.
It's true. I mean, and what we've also discovered, and Melissa, I'm going to shout out Melissa as being someone who has chased down the representations of these people and continued to reach out kind of over and over again. Sometimes they land in our lap. Most of the time, it's a lot of emails and phone calls.
Yep.
And then there are people that actually don't end up talking to us. We get very close. They have agreed, then they get scared, and literally will say, well, I just, I don't like talking about it. I let my art stand for itself, or they're worried they're going to have to be on camera, even though we tell them they don't have to be. It's easier for them to not talk about it, which I think is a very traditionally female place in our modern world.
Yes. And it's a generational. Yes.
It's generational. And so that's been almost heartbreaking, because you're like, please talk to us. We'll be the nicest people you've ever talked to about your career.
Right.
Yeah. We just want to hear your stories. We want to hear what you have to say.
It's also really, really great. We're really grateful when at the end of the interview, the people are very happy that they've talked with us. And I'm sure you've had that too, where you're like, they're really grateful they get to tell their story, and that it's someone who cares more than just whatever whatever their latest gig is, or more frivolous reasons. I mean, I love the frivolous. I'm a huge fan of the fans of these shows, because they have kept them alive. They've been the reason they got to DVD. They've been the reason they were released on streaming. We're pretty happy that Scarecrow Mrs. King only 1 or 2 seasons was available, and by the time we finished talking about it, all 4 were coming to be streamed.
That's
Remington
great.
Steele wasn't on, and then it was on. I'm not saying that we did it together.
Right.
Oh, we're taking credit for it.
Herstory.
We're taking credit for it.
And so it's been really, it's been really wonderful, but there's also this other thing where I feel like I want to go around and tell all women everywhere that their stories are super important. They don't because women don't talk about themselves that much because sometimes they get beat up for it.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And I can speak as someone who really didn't know, and this whole 2 years of this podcast has been such a learning experience for me in that way. Because I never really thought about how did these images and these people, these characters and these shows end up on my television screen. They just did, and I watched them and enjoyed them without really giving a lot of thought as to how that happened.
Mm-hmm.
And so it has been revelatory for me to learn and to get, and it's been a gift to me to be able to talk to these women in particular and hear their stories and hear what they went through and hear how they persevered and the joy that they had in making and working on these shows. It's as I said, every time we talk to somebody, it's just it's just I just can't even describe how much I get out of it.
So you spoke a little bit about Melissa's role. Melissa Roth is on your team. She's been on your team from day one, or since Susan put out her hook and reeled her in, whatever that might have been. Very charismatic, very energetic, knows her TV as well as I would venture to guess you two. So she's the one who goes on the hunt and kind of tracks them. And what else does she do? What does she bring to the team?
Well, she's usually in the room with us as well when we record in person, and sometimes on Zooms, basically to kind of catch things we don't catch. Hey, you didn't ask them about this. So she'll be writing me notes often and slipping them to me, and reminds me to hit record often on the Zooms, which
that's really important.
Early on, very, very important. And, it's just, I've also known Melissa almost as long as I've known Sharon. We met when I was in grad school at film school. And in fact, the way we met was she turned me down. Like she was a female DP, one of the few studying camera in film school. And so she had shot 2 sort of senior level films, and my senior level film, I got accepted to do mine. And I went to her and said, please shoot my film. And she was like, I've sort of been there, done that twice now. Your film, I'm sure, is great, but no, thank you. And it was, I couldn't get her. But then later, after film school, we shot a short together, and I went back and I'm like, okay, this is going to be it. And it was a much better experience overall to shoot with her. So I did get to direct and produce when she was DP for a film that was an award-winning film, the short film that we made together. How much? So we've known each other a long time. And so she brings a lot of producer stuff, and keeps us sort of on track and tells us when we're low energy and need more energy, but it's really managing our guests is a huge part of what she's doing, and getting releases and, getting their headshots and things that we need, and just communicating a lot with them. It just takes constant phone calls and emails. And then sometimes and then we'll brainstorm about how to reach somebody that, we got to Barney through the Producers Guild, which I'm a member of. That was great. And then Barney, a lot of our guests then help us really recommend us to other people. So a lot of people that we've gotten or almost gotten has been because of guests we've had on.
Your podcast has been out there as an award winner. You have been nominated in other areas. You are really out there using that as a promotional tool. Tell me a little bit more about some of the awards and the honorable mentions you've gotten, including that 2023 award.
So we've been very blessed. The podcast award, People Choice Podcast Award, just announced their nominations, and we have 2 for 2024. We won 3 podcast awards last year in 3 different categories. I kind of wasn't sure where we'd fit. So I submitted us for 3. And this year I submitted for 2, and we were nominated in both. And but we were also really blessed with a Webby Award nomination for Best Indie Podcast. As an indie podcaster, we have a small but mighty team, and having a team is so helpful. I have assistants that are also mentees of mine that manage a lot of our social media and a lot of the other stuff, because being a creator these days is an insane amount of work. This podcast has done so well, which we love, and I'm excited. It is definitely taking time from my other career as a writer, director, producer of indie work. And yet it's been a blessing, right? It's a double-edged sword of what you do. I also happened to had lovely years at Walt Disney Pictures in Buena Vista Pictures marketing, and which was basically getting a doctorate in marketing and publicity and the power and importance of that at a very neat time when social media was really becoming a thing. It was, we were literally the first employees of the digital marketing team at Disney. And then I got to run the division. And so I was really blessed to be in that mix of early digital marketing days. So I'm getting to use a lot of those tools. Some of them have changed. Many of them haven't, that I learned when I was there. And so social media is a big part of that. So we manage our social media as best we can. It's a little bit, everything is now a little bit beyond us now because it's been successful. So one of the things that's great about social media is your ability to communicate with your audience. And so we have fans of our show who talk to us, who email us several times, who give us suggestions, and they post on Facebook, like we'll post a clip from something with all the ABC stars from the 1982 Festival of Stars and ABC. And one of our fans will be like, literally list everybody in that video in the comments. And so you're like, great, they know more about this stuff than I do. And that is really spectacular, is this communication and love around these shows that were so formative to us. And that's been a blessing to us. I want more of that communication with them.
I want to, first of all, congratulate you all, the entire team, on the 2023 win and the recognition of the Webby. Is there anything that listeners of Advanced TV Herstory, once they dial up one or two of your episodes, is there anything that they can do to vote for you? Is that one of those awards where people can go on a website?
There is. We are nominated for Women in Podcasting Awards, which you should do next year because it will come back. It's womeninpodcasting.net. And the awards right now, you can vote. We're nominated and you can vote on the nominees. There are a lot of categories. We're in TV and film, but there are a lot of categories. You don't have to vote in every category.
Listeners, all of these links are going to be in our show notes. I just really want to say that I'm proud of you all for coming out of the gates with mostly a plan, but still it's a plan that's evolved organically and very successfully. And the people you have doing the very colorful graphics work and the social media and everything, you've really set a standard for people who are coming into this with the best of intentions.
I appreciate that. And I have to shout out my assistants, Sergio Perez and Sailor Franklin. Sergio is one of our 90s TV babies and is my assistant for 134 West, my production company. And he's an actor and a director and a writer and really quite talented. And he manages a lot of that artwork and social media for us. And Sailor helps manage our YouTube and our Patreon. So there's so much to keep up with. It's really insane. The people, my hat's off to people that do it mostly on their own. Yeah. And that's you. And you've been doing it for a long time. My hat's off also to all the podcasters, which were incredibly helpful to me and gave me a lot of advice. And the podcast community being so welcoming and so helpful and giving with advice. And the podcasters that have been there, like you, since 2016. I mean, it was harder to do this stuff in 2016 than it was in 2020. Zoom being one of the big, and so what you've built up is incredibly impressive too. So this is a mutual love society because you were one of the podcasts that I listened to as we were figuring out how to create our show, and Office Ladies and, big and small podcasts that I listened to be like, what do I want our podcast to be like? And then it's been it's just been a real gift. And a friend of mine was like, are you still doing that? And I'm like, I'm still loving it.
Yeah, right. Yes, me too.
Yeah.
Thinking about, I'm going to ask you the question that I ask many guests, not all guests, because So the Annie Potts, you mentioned Annie Potts in your note back to me. Annie Potts was an interesting get because she was just coming out with her nonprofit, the Heart Channels. I caught her at just the right time. My platform, my podcast distribution platform had a service, maybe they still do, called something calling. And it was then they were the gateway for recorded conversation, which would make it easier for my editor to be able to pull the audio. So I gave her the instructions, Annie, after she said yes. And, I just, anything to make that experience of, is technology going to work for us? Work? And so she called in, and then and I always put, here's my phone number in the event that something happens that day. And all of a sudden I get this text of, it's not working. It's not letting me in. And the sweat starts to just pour down my back. And I'm like, okay. And so then I reset the call or something like that, and it still didn't work. And so I'm then texting her back and I'm saying, I will send you, I had to say it this way. I will send you a Zoom link, and I promise if you send me your email address, I will never share it with anybody. And so she did. And then the next thing you know, we're on Zoom video. Okay, well, I was not dressed or looking like Zoom video. She was not dressed, but that's kind of how it evolved. I did take a little picture from below the screen and everything. And it just turned out to be this incredible conversation, and she wants to talk again. But boy, did I have a bit of a bone to pick with the service people at my podcast distribution platform, because this wasn't just any ordinary guest. So,
yeah, we had a similar thing with Linda Bloodworth Thomason, because we had set it up for Zoom thinking that she was going to be at a computer. And then when it all came down, it was like, oh, wait, you're not you're at a phone. Let me send you a phone number. And the first one we sent didn't work. And whatever, but we finally talked to her, and I was like, but that took, it takes 20 minutes, right? To solve this problem. And then she ended up talking to us for almost 2 hours. It was amazing and wonderful. And then we were also lucky enough during the writer's strike, we reached out to the Writers Guild to speak with a writer's strike captain, right? Mm-hmm. That's one of the joys of being in LA doing mm-hmm. this kind of podcast. Mm-hmm. And so they've been very great. They were very happy to have a strike captain on to talk to us about what the strike was about. And we were really careful about how we interviewed people mm-hmm. during that time, mm-hmm. So that we would follow the WGA rules. Yeah. And the SAG rules. Hmm. And so we have sort of, we now know people at the WGA in their publicity. So mm-hmm. we were invited to the WGA Awards, where Linda Bloodworth Thomason got her Lifetime Achievement. We were able to be on the red carpet and interview a lot of people. And then we were able to actually meet her. She didn't do the red carpet. Mm-hmm. So we only saw her after she won her award, when she came backstage with Jean Smart, who presented the award to her. Aww. And then she proceeded to go, oh, here are the ladies I told you about, the 80s TV ladies. You have to be on their show. We're like, yes, Miss Jean Smart. She's like, don't bother me. She was very nice. She was very gracious, but she's like, don't make me do something. But it was really great. And that's been a gift.
Julia Louis-Dreyfus, who is sort of doing what we're doing, only at a much higher level.
Yes. Cooler. Talking to amazing people.
And her first episode, she lost power while on the phone or on the line with Jane Fonda. My hat's off to JLD, because she's, we're all pulling on this same cart, and that's really important. So anyway, the question that I was going to pose to you is, what are the series from your growing up or from your adult life that still resonate? They just have this lasting impression that you can go back to them for comfort, or that you now realize played a bigger role than you expected at the time.
First one I'll mention is one that hopefully we'll have a chance to cover on 80s TV Ladies, Murphy Brown. Because again, another woman who lived her life the way she wanted, did things the way she wanted. She was a very atypical female character, show created by a woman. The fact that they basically just put up with her because she was so good at her job, mm-hmm. that the things that perhaps you would never expect anyone, let alone a woman, to get away with. She was able to get away with because she was so good at her job. And underneath it all, and yet she was certainly not a perfect person. Certainly not all aspects of her life were perfect. But I loved her ballsiness and I loved her unabashed, this is what I want and this is what I'm going to go get. Something I liked a lot about Stephanie Zimbalist's character in Remington Steele, if we're seeing a pattern here, perhaps. So I think I'll go with that one first.
Yeah, absolutely.
And just as an aside, I happened to go to a taping of Murphy Brown back in the day. It happened to be the episode where they were doing her baby shower. So you had Joan London, who was there, and Katie Couric, and several other news women of the time who were literally at, on the set. Yeah, it was a pretty amazing lineup of women in news in the late 80s. So anyway, Susan?
It's like picking a favorite child. So from the 80s, I'm going to start with the show that started it all, both for us, but for me. The Scarecrow Mrs. King, one of the reasons I loved it, one of the reasons it remained memorable for me was it was the first show where I saw female showrunners on screen credited. It wasn't the first show to be run by women, but it was the first time that I noticed it. And I didn't even notice Eugenie Ross Lemming's name first, even though she co-created the show. It was Juanita Bartlett, who had also been on Rockford Files.
Right.
So that name sort of popped for me. And I was like, and that was memorable for me as someone who was, again, just forming the idea that I wanted to be in making stuff, right? That somebody's job could be part of that was just beginning to form. And so women being able to be part of that, it was significant. And I just love the show because it's heart and goofy. And, it's kind of my sweet spot of 80s shows is a duo that, that bickers and loves each other and fights crime. And that could be male, that can be female, and that can be female. I love it all. For the 90s, it's got to be Buffy the Vampire Slayer, because I think that reignited the love of strong female characters in television. And then more recently, I'm going to shout out a show that I keep thinking about. I watched through twice and I can't wait. It's supposedly there's going to be a season 2. I will be very sad if it doesn't happen. The Extraordinary Attorney Woo, which is a Korean show. It's female led. It's got a really great cast. And it's basically a law show. It's different cases, case of the week, except that Attorney Woo is an autistic female lawyer. And so it's her basically trying to become an adult and live an adult life and live in a world that she doesn't quite understand. But she's a really good lawyer. So, but she doesn't understand people, right? So it's a very interesting show. It's like all of those sort of brilliant autistic person shows, but at the same time, it's so warm. All of the stories, all of the characters are really great. Even the bad guys are really fun. You're like, stop being bad, but it's just, to me, it's a real throwback show because it's a very hopeful show. We're coming back to the hopeful show, I think, hopefully, but we've been in a very dark show, TV show time.
Yeah, I will just kind of throw out, I continue to lament that it's difficult to find Lou Grant episode, because I know Lou Grant impacted my life in high school. There is a good book written by Douglas Daniel. I don't know if he's still alive, and it's called Lou Grant. Lou Grant, The Making of TV's Top Newspaper Drama. It's a great book, and April Smith was one of my guests, and she had written for Lou Grant. There was some crossover of Lou Grant and Cagney and Lacey. I continue to say that China Beach is by far the best written and best acted series of all time, and I believe that's 1988 to 1991. To anybody who's listening who feels like they've seen every good TV series, it is available as a boxed set, and that is the gift. I guess that's the quality TV viewer in your life, if they have a DVD player, I'll say.
If I may, there's a couple of other shows. First one is My So-Called Life.
Oh, yes.
It is the exception to my anti-teenager show mindset. I have watched it and rewatched it so many times. I don't think I've ever seen the lives of teenagers, in particular teenage girls, depicted so honestly. In several interviews, I think Winnie Holtzman is, for instance, talked about how because Claire Danes was so young and limited to the amount of time she could be on set, they ended up writing these conversations between Rayanne and Sharon Tursky, Angela's former best friend, in the girls' room where they're talking about sex on network television
Mm-hmm.
and what it's like for them as teenagers. And not to mention, certainly Angela's character and her parents were these three-dimensional characters with their own flaws and their own I love that show so much. It deserved more than the season that it got, but I'm very grateful that at least we got that much of it. And then I'm going to also bring up Grey's Anatomy. Yes, I am still watching it. I have watched it from day one, but from the beginning, certainly created by a woman and executive produced by scores of women, including Debbie Allen, whose show A Different World we just covered on our show. And it's always been about women in medicine, and it's always been about the lives of those women primarily. They've mostly been the focus. And yes, it's had ups and downs, as anything does. For goodness sake, it's season 21 or 22, I think, this fall, for goodness sake. But I love that show, and I can't recommend it enough. I just think it's awesome.
It's awesome and incredibly groundbreaking, right? It created Shonda Rhimes' career, and then she went on to create so much and also produce so much women-centered work that also had women behind the scenes. Yeah. So one of those shows that not only keeps going in its actual show, which is insane, right? But it gave people careers, and it gave women careers and people of color careers in front of and behind the scenes. Her legacy is very much sealed in that.
Yes. When I think about Linda Bloodworth Thomason's career as Les Moonves was basically riding her out of town, he prevented her from mentoring and bringing other women along and continuing to open doors for them. Because it was also then at that time, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I sort of think, Murphy Brown's rights are all locked up, and Linda was sent out of town. So we've got Diane English, who really, her best work is never going to be seen. And Linda, and all of these women were sort of hushed up and told to go away. And that's, I think, some of what continues to drive me to bring those stories forward, to make an environment comfortable, such as you were saying. Come, tell us whatever you want to tell us, whatever you're comfortable telling us. We want to celebrate that because it really is more important than anybody has any idea.
I think one of my favorite stories from any of our guests is Linda Bloodworth Thomason telling us about the foundation she created in her hometown. She, after the first season of Designing Women, took her money and had created this to create opportunities for girls in that area, in this relatively rural part of Missouri. And I don't know of too many other people, men or women, who have done something like that, but she actually did it. Yes. She actually changed the lives of scores of girls in her little town because she recognized that she was in a position to do it. And that just blew me away. It really did. And that's the kind of thing that people should know more about someone like her, that for whatever talent she has as a writer, as a producer, that she's looking at the bigger picture and is in a position to do something about it. So she did.
So wrapping up, listeners, this is a friendship that just sort of got formed a little out of the blue a couple of years ago, because we were coming at this from very different, at least at the minimum, different time zones. thank you both for your afternoon today. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in, not just to Advanced TV Herstory, but do scroll through the archive of 80s TV ladies. You are undoubtedly going to stumble upon a treasure that you didn't even know existed. We really appreciate the listeners who engage in this important reflection and important study of American popular culture, because I think we are still writing that book. It's just that now we're writing it from a bit of a longer view.
Thank you for having us on and for the work that you do, because it's inspiring to us.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, listeners, take care. And by all means, keep listening to Advanced TV Herstory and the 80s TV ladies. Thank you.